Lauren, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so for people that maybe perhaps aren't familiar with your content, as a first-time viewer, how would you describe the type of content that you're putting out? Like what's kind of your main focus for your channels? And I know you've got multiple, but give us a kind of an overview here.
Sure. Well, I talk a lot about politics, but also social commentary and pop culture. I definitely come from things from more of a conservative perspective. And what I found frustrating about the conservative movement is that for the longest time, they've really ignored pop culture and social issues, current events, and just stuck to policy. And let's talk about lower taxes. And don't get me wrong, I like that too, but I try to have a more holistic approach to my commentary. So we talk about a little bit of everything, actually.
Got it. So you were a conservative, but you went to USC. What was that like? That's in California, right?
Yeah, so it's fun. I went to USC. How old was I? That was probably almost like 10 years ago, and don't do any math on, my age in relation to that. But
I'm Asian, so I kind of have to do the math really quickly there.
Yeah. Well, I feel like things were different back then. I mean, don't get me wrong. Campus of 65,000, and there were like 10 people at the college Republicans meeting. But we never got protested or anything like that. And, I was one of the few, I guess, right wing people in a lot of my classes, especially my political science classes. But, surprisingly enough, I didn't face any hostility or anything like that. But with college campuses nowadays, I feel like the experience is quite different. And I am thankful that I studied when I did, because I think some people have a hard time now when their opinions don't really fit in with the rest of their peers or their professors.
Oh yeah, it's a death sentence now with things that are happening in college. I mean, you can't say anything. I mean, I know stand-up comedians are just refusing to go, despite how much money that the universities are willing to pay. They're not willing to perform at these universities because just any little thing that you would say, you get canceled now, since everyone's filming as well. It's kind of impossible to speak your mind these days a little bit. But yeah, was it a little bit difficult? Like were you vocal about your stance in terms of the conservative status when you were in college as well? And how did that stand with some of your peers?
I mean, I wasn't as vocal as I am now, because I guess it would be hard to be, since now talking about politics is all I do. But I know I had a comparative politics class where my professor was actually a self-described Marxist. But again, I was fairly impressed because he didn't hide his own political views, which I think, some people might consider problematic in and of itself. But he never made me afraid to voice my own opinions or to ask questions. And I really respected him for that. And like I was saying, I think there was only maybe one person from my time there who I remember kind of trying to ostracize me or no longer wanting to be my friend once he found out that I was, doing all of these things with the college Republicans and stuff like that. It's not the same now, though. And I think there's several things that have contributed to this shift in like willingness to converse with people with different opinions. I think, being conservative now has really, a lot of people try to link it with just outright being racist or sexist, bigoted, xenophobic in ways that, yes, were happening 10 years ago, but to a much lesser extent. And now it's gotten to the point where, I mean, I haven't spoken at a college campus in several years, but the last time I did, there were people protesting, little old me. Essentially it became just a huge session for them to air all of their grievances against conservatives and stuff like that. And it was just a very different environment, thankfully, than the one that I had studied in.
Yeah, and it's for sure there is some perceptions when people are talking about conservative, especially obviously coming in from places like California or New York. But if all of these things were happening 10 years ago, which much more severe than now, why do you think it is now these days that people are having such a vocal opinion around this divide?
I've thought a lot about that, and it's hard to attribute it specifically to one thing, but I would say that social media probably has played a pretty big role. I mean, if you look at internet discourse, I mean, the most outrageous headlines always get the most clicks, which is natural. And heck, I'm on YouTube. I love myself a catchy headline as much as the next person. But when we see these sensationalized stories and we don't see, the average views of the average person or whatever, then it's very easy to feed into this like echo chamber and kind of, get used to the escalating rhetoric. And I think, if you are a college student who very likely doesn't have any conservative friends or family members or professors, and all you see is people calling others Nazis and bigots or whatever online without actually hearing from the people themselves, then I think it would be very easy to fall into a system where you actually believe that that's true. And, you start to buy into the idea that it's us versus them. And same goes for, Republicans and conservatives on the other side of that too. Echo chambers are everywhere nowadays, unfortunately. And I think it would have been a lot harder without things like Twitter and Facebook to kind of like for these different groups to radicalize each other. Because, I mean, the way we're operating right now, it is so easy to cut yourself off from the entire other side of politics.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of a divide, obviously you've probably seen kind of the attacks, I guess, for lack of a better word, around, Asian Americans that are happening in San Francisco to New York. What are your thoughts on like the xenophobia that is happening in America?
Well, it's frustrating. And, I'm half Chinese. I don't really look it, though. But my dad is a little old Chinese man. And when I, see people being attacked for being Asian, part of me does think, oh, gosh, like, would that happen to my dad if he were walking in New York or San Francisco? And it's kind of interesting how that whole the xenophobia has really played out against Asians, because I think it's a combination of things right now. I mean, you have coronavirus, which, because of its potential origins, a lot of people are associating, hey, maybe if you're Asian, you're more likely to get it, in which case going up to them and physically assaulting them is probably the last thing you would want to do if you actually are scared of getting corona, but that's its own thing. And then, you also have these increasing political tensions with China. And so it's hard, and it's trying to get people to see the difference between, criticizing, for example, the Chinese government versus assuming that every Asian person you see walking down the street, who very likely may not even be Chinese, is part of that regime. There's a difference between saying, oh, hey, this disease might have its roots here versus saying, oh, that means every Chinese person is probably more likely to get it. And I think because as a culture, we've bought more into identity politics and racial politics than we have ever before, at least in my generation. Those distinctions between groups and individuals, they're getting harder and harder to make. And I think, unfortunately, this is one of the many downsides, I think, of really buying into those group and identity politics, is that, when it's good for you, you might think, all right, I have all these special interests. But when it's bad, it affects everyone in your group, as we're seeing now for Asian Americans. Yeah.
The most frustrating part is the fact that these people are targeting people that can't defend themselves. Right. I mean, if you're talking about, talking about like 60-year-old women, 7-year-old women, it's just like so frustrating that these things are happening. I mean, where do you see this going in the next 2 to 3 years if this was to keep up? I mean, how are we supposed to, in your opinion, kind of fight through this or work through it?
Well, I think, like you said, it's so frustrating to see how many of these attacks are focused on the elderly. I mean, I think you have to be a bad person regardless to just go and randomly start assaulting someone. But you throw on top of that the whole age issue, and it's just like, my goodness, like, how were you raised that you think this is okay? But I think over the past 4 years, we've seen an escalation in political violence, if I can say. Riots and protests have steadily increased in severity, and it seems like for a lot of the people who are perpetrating these acts, there's been no consequences. So I think, unfortunately, unless people start seeing that, there's rule of law, you can't just go around, breaking windows or assaulting people, and whether you're doing it for the left wing or right wing reasons, you will be held accountable. I think unless we start kind of clamping down on these attacks, they're going to keep happening as people see that there's no consequences.
Now, I know you don't look obviously like full Asian, because as you mentioned, but did you deal with racial stereotypes growing up? I've seen like I've got a lot of half Asian friends, but some of them, they sometimes when they're younger, they look a lot more Asian, and then up to their 20s or whatever it might be, they end up kind of changing form. I don't know if that was the same case for you, but did you deal with a lot of racial stereotypes growing up, and how did you deal with that?
Well, it's funny. I find I did look more Asian when I was younger. I don't know if you can tell, but I now have like a nose bridge. But when I was little, that wasn't there. And so I guess my features were a little bit more Asian looking. But I actually grew up in Hong Kong. So me looking Asian, I guess I would have fit in more than me looking Eurasian. But in Hong Kong, it's not. And other places I've lived, like Singapore, it's not uncommon to be mixed, to have one parent who's Caucasian and one parent who is Asian. And actually, I didn't really ever put much stock into, even thinking about my racial identity before I moved to the US and Canada, where it was kind of more unusual, especially in the US. I know I almost had a bit of an identity crisis because, there were a lot of like things that I missed from home, like Chinatowns and the food and things that I would maybe try to go to, but then people would look at me as if I was an outsider. Whereas in Hong Kong, it's very multicultural in terms of the expat community. There's a lot of mixed people. I never felt that kind of almost being judged to be not white enough, but also not Asian enough. So that was kind of strange.
Yeah, we've had Anna Akana on the show that she had a very similar experience. She's half Japanese and half, I guess she's got a mixture of that on that side of things. But yeah, it's just not being able to fit in onto the Asian side because you don't look Asian enough. And then from the other side, it's you're, I guess, more treated as an Asian and more of an outsider in that case, depending on, where you live. But that's cool though. How long were you born in Hong Kong and you grew up there until up to your teens, and Singapore as well?
So I was actually born in Canada, but I left for Hong Kong with my parents, of course, when I was a baby. I stayed there until I was about 10 or 11. Then we moved to Shanghai. And after that, London and then Singapore. We moved quite a bit because of my parents' jobs. And then I eventually ended up coming to the US for school. And it's kind of interesting because I have not a lot of, but I have some Asian friends who are, American born or Canadian born, and they've never been to Asia at all. And it has frustrated me at some points, them being treated as more Asian when like they've literally never even been to Asia, but me who's grown up there, who's lived there because I'm half white, kind of getting treated like, oh, but you're a white person. It's like, well, you've never actually been to China or Hong Kong. And even I've spoken out against the idea of ethno-nationalism. Maybe like 4 years ago, the alt-right was a way bigger presence on the internet than they are now. And I would have people say, it's like, well, you're being hypocritical by saying that, the US shouldn't be only for white people because you still identify with being from Asia, even though you're half white. It's like, no, I'm not identifying with it just because of the way I look. Like I grew up there.
Yeah.
Like, I'm from there. So it's definitely shaped the way I've been treated in certain situations and the way my political views have formed, I think.
No, for sure. I mean, I grew up in Korea. I was born in Korea until I was 7, moved to Canada, and then basically didn't live in Asia until since I was 7. And right. I certainly feel more Western. Like I don't feel my identity, certainly obviously physically Korean, but I think in English. Obviously, like I have certain views that are much more Western, and right. It is kind of crazy to think that people are treating you differently just because of your physical appearance. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense since they don't know a lot about you, but do you feel more a certain way, or is it like a divide for you when you're thinking about your identity now? I know you had like an identity crisis when you were young.
Yeah, well, I think politically, I'm definitely more Western, and I would attribute that to even when I was in Asia, I was going to American school, so I grew up with more of a Western focused curriculum. But I think one of the differences where I do definitely identify more with my Asian side is when it comes to like relationships and family matters. Growing up with an Asian father in Asia is, I think, for most people a very different experience than if you had grown up with like a Western father in the West, and that extends to schoolwork, dating, just how I expect marriage to go. To like I kind of did the traditional Asian thing where it's like I lived with my parents until I got married and then moved in with my husband, which is, and even throughout school, which is not a common thing among my Western friends, but for me, it's like whatever, even living at home throughout college. And I fully expect my parents to move in with me when they get older. And that was something that I had to kind of break to my like then fiance at the time, like, by the way.
Yeah, I know we're married, but yeah, it's too late.
Pretty much. And I think that family closeness, or even the idea of like an honor shame culture, is something that I'm much more I think I put more stock into than maybe how Westerners operate. And, seeing how Western culture has kind of evolved with the way that young people behave and things like that, it's really made me kind of miss my upbringing, the way I was raised in Asia. And, right now I'm actually trying to figure out like, how can I provide more structure and discipline to a child's upbringing in a world like in America or Canada, where it seems like there's increasingly less and less of that.
Yeah. How do you think about that? Do you already have a newborn on its way, or yeah?
So hopefully that'll be coming soon. But I mean, I've been looking into things like homeschooling and different private schools and more closely knit communities, because I mean, it's just a totally different experience. And, we look at a lot of the issues that kind of plague teens in Western countries, whether that's like drinking, drugs, or, having sex really, really young. And it's not to say that doesn't happen in Asia, because of course it does, or even, dropping out of school. But it's like the rates of that are so much less. Like it's way, way less common. I know I was exposed to so many things that I had never even, heard of kind of when I switched over to school in London. And, I don't, it's not that I want to kind of like shelter my kids, but I don't want to introduce them or have them be introduced to things before they're old enough to understand how serious they might be or the right way to interact with them. And I mean, yeah, we're looking more and more at homeschooling because it's a scary time to be trying to raise kids right now.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it may actually be a good idea, just because, a child's brain at that age is so heavily influenced that sometimes it's hard to rewire that after a certain age. Just trying at our age, trying to break habits that you could easily reform when you were 15 or 16. Yeah, it's a huge, huge deal. What was living in Singapore like? I've always been fascinated by that country just because of this like perfect utopian world. Yet at the same time, you have this insane death penalty of like, small things that maybe are legal, like 2 ounces of weed in Canada, obviously. What was that like?
I think I was around 14 or 15 when I was living there. So I definitely wasn't, as keyed into the, I guess, political reality of Singapore, which I've heard be described as a benevolent dictatorship. And but I know that from my own experience, it was a wonderful place to live, especially at my age. Like I was 15, where you're starting to kind of want to go places with your friends. And I know that my parents, they could let me stay out until late at night and not worry about my safety, because Singapore is a very, very safe place. And, it's multicultural. There, Chinese people, Indian people, Malaysian people, Indonesian people all living together. But there's, the Singaporean nationalism is enough that, they're unified in their Singaporeanness, which I think is actually a really, really beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. I love the Singaporean people. I haven't been back in quite a while now, and I would love to visit again. But, now that I'm older, I realize that there's also a darker side of the country. I'm friends with Melissa Chen, who she's a Singaporean writer, if people aren't familiar with her, who's in the States. And she's, been very outspoken about criticizing the government there. And, there are things like blasphemy laws in Singapore, which, coming from a Western perspective, seems hard to imagine. But that is the reality. But yeah, I mean, overall, my experience with Singapore was a very positive one. I love the weather. I love the food, and I would love to go back someday.
Yeah, with Singapore, just given how much of a third world that they started with, when they were first founded. I forgot about the president. Is it Lee Kuan Yew, the first like founding president of Singapore, who really had to do some drastic things to set certain things that certainly worked at that time. Obviously, you need certain leaders for, there's wartime leaders and then there's like peacetime leaders, and he was certainly like that wartime leader. But I think some of those things just kind of been ingrained into the culture and the regulations within Singapore that there's certainly a dark side to it. I think there was like a controversial statement that he said something around like Islamic people not fitting into the culture within Singapore. Like he was okay with every other religion except for the Islams, and I think he took that back eventually, but it was still out there. It was like a very controversial statement. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard about that particularly, but I have heard about people being charged with violating blasphemy laws in Singapore for talking about the Quran and criticizing it. So I mean, it seems like it's almost come full circle. First you're criticizing Islam as leader, and now your nation is like protecting Islam from criticism. But yeah, it's definitely very interesting how the politics of Singapore have kind of, they've been very authoritarian, but if you look now, they don't have a lot of the same social fractions that, let's say, the US does. So it's kind of interesting but they're, I would say, more diverse as a country. So it's,
in what way are they more diverse, you think?
I think just like racially, they're more diverse than the United States, and really? Also in terms of like background, because you're not just saying, oh, you look different, right? There are people who are actually from Indonesia. There are more people who are actually from Malaysia who are now in Singapore. So it's not just like this superficial racial diversity. It's like, it's also different cultures, it's different religions. But like I said, there's such a strong identity of being Singaporean that at least, they can share in that. And when I look at the US and Canada, it feels like we're so fractured in so many ways, not just politically, but also by race, and a lot of times by language in Canada, even in the United States as well. And so I look at Singapore and I think we have something to learn from them. I'm not saying that their government is perfect or something to be emulated, but there's a unity there that I appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I agree with Canada, at least for Toronto. You and I both living in Montreal now. Do you feel that it's as strong in Canada per se? Like, I think Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. I never felt that. Yeah, go ahead.
Toronto definitely is. When was the last time you lived in Montreal? Because I know it's definitely changed in the past 5 years.
Has it? Okay. I lived there in this summer just for 3 months. I was in Vancouver and then flew to Montreal for like 3 months. But obviously it was Corona, so I didn't exactly go out, right? So I didn't get a certain sense. But how did it change over the last 5 years?
I mean, well, immigration has changed a lot of, I guess, like the social issues. It's not just English now that is kind of like the other language in Quebec that the Quebecois don't really like. And for people who aren't familiar with the politics of Quebec who are listening, it's its own basket case of issues. It's like one of the few places on the planet that has language laws. I think in one of my political science classes at universities, when we were talking about language laws, the two examples they had were post-Soviet Ukraine and also Quebec. So yeah, it's interesting. You can't have signs in English in Quebec because they want to protect the French language. Now they're even talking about limiting the number of students who can go to English college because they want more people speaking French. And now because of this new wave of immigrants who have come in, a lot of whom speak neither English nor French, the whole focus and push for assimilation is more to teach them French. So, and also Quebec has its own preferences for immigrants. They prefer ones who speak French versus ones who speak English. And so we have quite a substantial, Haitian population, because they speak a French and sometimes Creole that's, easier to learn, the Quebecois, than if you're coming into it with no French at all. But yeah, it's definitely something that if you kind of live downtown, you see a lot. There are these cultural ghettos forming, whereas when my parents were living here, that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Also, Quebecois French, like, come on, do we really need to preserve that? It's not the prettiest sounding language. Do you speak French?
Yeah, I do speak French. I mean, it's not, I definitely couldn't do my videos in French, but retail, just day-to-day life, it's fine. But no, I agree. It's not the prettiest language.
But yeah, that's a complication on its own. And so when you lived in Hong Kong and you moved over to London, you said, after living in Asia for what, like 15 years, I guess? No, 17 years?
14 or
14,
something.
15 years. I mean, that's like that's an entire chapter in your entire life, right? It shapes so much of who you are, what your beliefs are, and who your identity is. What was some of the things that was like a culture shock for you coming into, I guess, more of the Western world?
It was a huge culture shock. I remember there were just so many things. Like, I wasn't used to only having English television at that time. It was like a big treat, because when I was growing up in Hong Kong, there was satellite, but we didn't have it. And so, there were like 2 English channels. And then after, I think it was like 7 or something, they were only in Chinese. So it's like, really, you get like 1.5 English channels.
Yeah.
So it was very strange, it was being exposed to all this different candy at the time. And, and not just that, but when I went to the UK, I was familiar with Western culture. I went to American schools, and my parents are Canadian, but that's very different from British culture in and of itself. And I remember we were moving in, and I was alone at home one day, just hanging out. And then someone came in the front door and said, "Hey, are your parents here?" They just came in. They didn't knock. They just entered the door. And I was so shocked and confused. And it's like, that's not okay, is what I was thinking. But the guy was being so nonchalant and polite about it. I was like, but maybe it's okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, when in England, and we were in Surrey, so maybe it was more like small town England, people would just come in our house. Like, our neighbors would just come in our house. And that was this, like, I didn't, and it's funny, being Canadian, I'm also like, well, I don't want to be rude, but also, why are you in my house? So it was, yeah, there was a lot of that. And, not just that, but also like coming from, these Asian cities where it's very urban, to Surrey, where you're probably not, it's just a different vibe. But at the same time, it's like more quiet, but more dangerous. That was very strange to me. And it was also strange, yeah, like I said, having everything being in English. But it was a good experience. And I think people maybe in the US and Canada don't appreciate how different British culture is than American or Canadian culture. Just because we speak the same language, it doesn't mean it's the same.
Yeah, it's completely different.
Yeah.
What was the dating scene also different for you when you were coming from Asia into the UK? Maybe the UK is, again, it's very different than the US in terms of the dating scene, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, well, I was throughout high school not doing a lot of dating. I'll just be upfront. But I remember that boys seemed more interested in me in Asia than they did in the UK, for sure. For sure.
Whoa, why is that?
I don't know. I mean, of course, like, there are different standards of beauty in different cultures. That's normal. And it's the same thing. Like, even now when I go back to Asia, I find I get a lot more male attention than any time that I'm in like the US or Canada, for sure.
But you also said you looked more Asian when you were younger, right? So has that shifted at all?
I still didn't look full Asian when I was younger, but I think I did look more mixed. But I mean, even now when I go back to Asia, I don't know, I get more attention than being in the US or Canada. So I don't know what that's about, but yeah, that was, I thought, interesting.
Yeah. Also, guys are a little bit more forward in the US and maybe Canada as well, right? When it comes to approaching women versus Asia. I don't know what Hong Kong and Singapore is like, to be honest, but that's the feeling I get.
I don't know. Maybe it's because I don't really leave my house much, but I never get approached randomly by people in the US or Canada. Whereas that has happened in Asia, not just like randomly you're a stranger on the street, hey, let me stop you and get your number, but just if you're in a social situation, they would be more willing to express interest in like going on a date than US and Canada. Yeah, and I'm not sure why.
Huh, you're like breaking all sorts of stereotypes in my head right now. I would have thought the exact opposite. That's interesting. Okay.
Maybe it's just me though. Maybe I need to like get on the Western aesthetics board. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, one thing that I wanted to dig in with you is the kind of the shift in religion that you had. I personally was born a Catholic, and it's weird to admit this, but when I was like 13, I was like infatuated with a girl, and I ended up becoming Protestant for like 2 years or 3 years. And then after university, I just shifted into more, I guess, agnostic perspectives. And I know you got an interesting journey around how you went from, I think, Catholic to atheism, and then back into, not back, but to Evangelical Protestant. What was that journey like from like the beginning, and what are some of the shifts that happened that made you convert into these different journeys?
Sure. Well, I think when I was growing up, I was like a Christmas, Easter Catholic. Like those are the kind of when religion was really a bigger part of my life. I had gone to Bible school or like Bible camp when I was younger, but it wasn't a huge part of my life or something that I really even thought of. So, I kind of grew up with some Catholic traditions and things like that. If someone would have asked me when I was like 12, I guess I would have said, oh, I'm Catholic, because that's what my parents were. But when I first kind of started becoming interested in actually thinking and talking about religion, I started reading people like Richard Dawkins and things like that, the God delusion. And, before that, I had never really thought of like, well, is this in conflict with science or anything like that? But, reading all of that stuff, to me at the time, that made sense. And, I was very much an empiricist and a materialist. So I thought, all right, yeah, atheism. And I was like one of those super cringy teenage atheists, with the fedora tipping. I probably would have had one had I been an atheist in current year. But yeah, I kind of stuck with that for a while. But then as I got even a little bit older, my brother is really interested in philosophy. So he introduced me to some philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and things like the theory of forms and unmoved mover. They sort of helped me imagine a world where, science isn't everything, because science can never really answer why, because it's not necessarily a scientific question, right? These wanting to know these qualifiers. And the way I see it, science, it almost tells you how the system works, but not really how it came to be. Or even, for moral questions, science really isn't the most useful thing to go off of, because then you can lean towards too much utilitarianism, which has been responsible for many, many terrible things like eugenics. And so, I kind of through that exploration became more of a deist, without subscribing to any particular religion, but maybe just thinking perhaps there is more to being than just the material, than just science, than just what we can see and touch in front of us.
Sorry to cut you off. Just for people that don't know, what's the difference between agnostic and deism?
Sure. So I guess like agnostic is kind of, and I don't know if this describes your specific agnosticism, but, acknowledging that we don't know everything, and that's okay. And there are probably some things that as humans we will never fully understand, but not necessarily being an atheist where you can definitively say there is nothing, but also not subscribing to a particular religion or worldview or anything like that. For me, the difference between agnosticism versus a deism is that I was more convicted that there was, some creator or some mover. So I guess, those annoying people who say like, oh, I'm spiritual, but not religious.
It's like the most lazy perspective. I admit it. Like, it's like, you're not in one stance or the other. It's just like, it could happen. Something's out there.
You can call it lazy. And I've heard like atheists especially rag on agnostics, but I think it's a valid thing. Like, I don't know, like, why be so firm in your conviction of yes or no if like being firm in agnosticism is its own stance, which I've gone through myself as well. But with theism, it's the idea that, yeah, there probably is some unmoved mover, some creator force out there, but you're not, saying like, yes, but it is Jesus of the Bible, and yeah, Muhammad was his prophet and things like that. It's actually quite a little bit later where I made the transition from deism to specifically theism and Christianity, because, from the almost Platonic Aristotelian worldview that I had, where, this ultimate form of good must exist somewhere, and somewhere there must also be this unmoved mover who started this whole reaction. To me, that fit the Christian worldview the most, especially when you look at kind of the theology behind the atonement. It's the idea of trying to make up for humanity's imperfection through a perfect sacrifice. And to me, the idea, I truly believe that for us to have any type of, I guess, input as to whether something is good or bad, there must be somewhere out there this total perfect vision of what is good. And, to me, that is God, that is the creator. But, the thing with that is having this divine standard of goodness, of perfection. It really illustrates how fallen and imperfect man is, which a lot of religion is based around, specifically Abrahamic religions. But Christianity is really the only one that offers a solution to that imperfection.
And well, it's interesting for me, especially from if you were a Protestant from the age that you were born and you continue to become and have that stance, maybe I wouldn't be as interested. But because of this journey that you've been on, you've intentionally decided to shift course into this path. A lot of people, because of how their parents were raised, are just kind of put into this religion, as I was, and as many people are, and they just kind of stick through it, right, without really having to think about what is the real purpose of it. But what I found really interesting about your approach is just you've actually done the research, you've looked at and really thought about the different perspectives. For me, at least, like the thing that didn't really resonate with me is just it felt a little bit strict for me in terms of like the limitations and some of the things that perhaps were also a little bit outdated. And those were some of those things that I struggled with, at least particularly in my teenage years. And how have you thought about that? Has there been, going from atheism to getting back into the religion, especially in the world that we live now, where obviously there's New Testaments and stuff like that, but did you feel that like there's been some limitations or certain things that may not make sense in that world?
Well, not only when I started college in the US, not only was I going from like kind of strict Asian upbringing to college in LA, but this was also sort of the time when I was really trying to embrace a Protestant lifestyle. And so there was big culture shock there as well. I'm going to parties with my friends and I see people who are on all types of substances and, who are doing things that Bible says you shouldn't do. And, for me, I guess it's also part of a personality type thing. I'm someone who thrives on structure and things like that. So the idea, and also just taking into account my reasons for embracing Christianity, those restrictions on behavior made perfect sense, right? If there is this ultimate form of good and this objective moral stance, then surely there must be things that are objectively acceptable and objectively unacceptable. So that was very easy for me to commit to once I had it in my mind that, if I think something is right, do I want to be the type of person who does it? Or sorry, if I don't think something is right, do I want to be the type of person who does it anyway, right? And I think there are people out there who will look at things like promiscuous sex and drugs and think, I don't see a problem with it and I'm going to do it anyway, which in that worldview makes sense. But there are also people kind of lukewarm Christians who will say, yeah, I don't think this is okay, and I know why it's bad, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's a difference there. And to me, those lukewarm people have never made sense, right? Because if you have convictions and you don't think you can understand the rationality of why you shouldn't do it. Why are you still doing it? Like, is it a self-control issue? And for me, I wouldn't be able to, I guess, live with the guilt of having failed my own standards as well as any divine standards and still partake in that behavior. So, yeah. And I mean, even I went to a Mormon university for a while. That's where I ended up finishing. After my time at USC, I'm not Mormon though, but they were even stricter. I mean, you're not allowed to wear anything above the knee. You're not even allowed like tea or coffee. Like, they are really strict. And
how did you even get there though? How did you go from where you were and you just decided to? No, doesn't that just happen, right?
Yeah, I ended up part of my high school, since we were moving around so much, I did through independent study. And BYU has one of the best independent study catalogs out there. And after a while, I wanted to move from USC and change majors. I was at USC doing political science and screenwriting, and I wanted to do more political science, Middle East studies. And I was looking up the best Arabic programs. BYU has one of the top ones. And since my independent study credits were already from there, and I also got a scholarship, so it just made sense. That was before I knew about Mormonism. I'm not sure I would have chosen that school if I knew what I know now about it. But yeah, for me in university, that was hard, living by restrictions that I didn't see the justification for. I still don't think coffee and tea are moral wrongs. So that if
Do you think those are moral wrongs? I'm confused. You have to slow it down for me. They think coffee. I don't know anything about it. So what are the things that they teach you?
Yeah, so if you're Mormon, you can't drink tea, you can't drink coffee, you can't drink any alcohol. Yeah, so you would be a bad Mormon right now. You can't wear anything above the knee, you can't wear anything form-fitting. Was part of the honor code. You can't have someone from the opposite sex in your room. We're not even talking about doing anything. You just literally cannot have them in your room.
But I thought Mormons are the ones that can have multiple wives.
Yeah, but that you have to be married. So it's yeah, so it's before that though, super strict. And yeah, so that was when I was in a position where I had all of these guidelines that I didn't believe in, and that was challenging, because it's I don't think it's bad to have coffee. Or even I don't drink, but I don't think it's wrong to have a sip of beer, or have a beer with your dinner. So that was hard for me.
So how do they must have some justifications of these rules, right? So for people that are from the Jewish culture, they can't eat pig because pigs are known to have from the food chain, they're known to be dirty animals. So for coffee and tea, where there's scientific benefits that you can prove.
Especially tea.
Yes.
Tea is a health thing.
Yeah.
So what I understand, part of it is obedience. Part of it is, in their minds, the fact that, okay, our leaders have told us not to do this, and obedience is a virtue. So we can show our obedience and devotion by doing this. Another part of it is that it's easy. They're also supposed to abstain from tobacco. So it's easy to, tobacco's not good for you. With alcohol, there is scientific literature backing up the idea that it's not good for you, whether that is to the extent where you can't have it at all. I'm not sure, but perhaps there's that argument that can be made that if there's not really benefits and, you can risk addiction and going overboard, maybe just best to abstain at all from anything. And I think for more the soft, even some Mormons don't even drink caffeinated soft drinks. I think the main takeaway there really is for obedience.
Wow. Okay. Now, would you say that can be true for other religions like Christianity as well? Did you feel any of that? Or was that a good enough limitation or not? I don't want to say limitation, but it's good enough. I can't find another word for it, but it's at least it's it's not as extreme as Mormonism.
Well, I think and I know, it's different for different branches of Christianity. One of the reasons why I could never be Catholic and why I'm not Catholic, my husband is Catholic, is because I do see Catholicism like that. There are a lot of things in the Catholic religion that I don't see in the Bible, that I don't see really any reasoning behind. And so it would be hard for me to buy into that religion wholeheartedly. One of the examples is why priests cannot marry. That's not in the Bible, that someone who is, a representative of the church cannot marry. It actually wasn't even instituted in the Catholic Church from the beginning. We know when and why it was instituted. It had to do with land dealings within the church. And so for me, why? That just seems very man-made and arbitrary. But if I look at the way that Christianity has kind of, I guess some would say, restricted my life, I do see reasons beyond obedience for doing it. One of the things that the Bible teaches is sobriety. Right. And I think, if we look at the consequences of alcohol and drug abuse, it is clear that there are reasons aside from Christianity for adhering to that. We have straight edge movements that have nothing to do with Christianity, but still see the value in sobriety. Another issue would maybe say casual sex. There are now studies being done about how, the number of previous sexual partners you've had as a woman actually does increase your likeliness to get a divorce once you are married. And, as well as things like unplanned pregnancies and STDs as well. Having more promiscuous sex also increases your likeliness of being depressed, having anxiety issues, and all of these other things. So, when and I'm someone who's somewhat of an empiricist myself, when I see that what's written in the Bible is actually what we can see is beneficial through a secular lens, I don't have a problem, living my lifestyle in line with that. And I don't see it as just arbitrary and for obedience, because I'm someone who, because I said so doesn't really seem like a good reason to do something for me.
Sure. Yeah. And I agree with all of these things. There's certainly good parts about religion, and it's certainly proven. I went through this 10-day silent meditation trip called Vipassana, and they were teaching all of these elements, and it certainly felt like a little bit like a religious thing to me. But basically what I've done and what I try to do is I try to take parts that I believe in and I try to construct it into my own beliefs. And I just wonder if people can do that without needing to wholeheartedly jump into the religious beliefs and take what is good from certain aspects and apply that to their lives without needing to completely dedicate into a religion, if they don't want to, at least.
Well, I think there is something to that. I think that many religions have very positive aspects to it. And I think that, there's nothing wrong with taking a teaching from a religion and applying it to your own life because it's beneficial, even if you don't maybe believe in the, core tenets of that religion. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know, I have friends from different religious backgrounds, and there will be I know something I do like from Mormon culture is they have something called family home evening, where at least once a week you get together with your family and you just spend time doing an activity or something, and you just bond together. And I think that's a wonderful thing to do. I'm not Mormon, but I really like the idea of that. I also like how their culture is very focused on family, and how they have a culture where they're encouraged as college age people to go out and date with the purpose of getting married. So, you have your eyes set on creating a family. I think those are all great things. And I don't think you need to believe in Joseph Smith to want to apply those to your life, for sure.
Yeah. And then obviously with things like Christianity and other religions, there's things that are taught and beliefs that people have within that religion that are perhaps from a societal perspective might seem controversial today. So things like gay marriage, abortions and stuff like that. What are your stances on that as someone that is of Christian faith? And I think there's two buckets of people that generally go from atheism into different religions. Is they've already had these certain beliefs before they converted, and it was more of a confirmation bias where okay, this religion is something that I can already resonate with. And then there's people that kind of had to convert, and they've completely changed their identity after getting into that religion. Where do you fall into that aspect? And I guess, what are your stances on things like gay marriage?
Well, I think from those two positions, I guess I would be somewhat in the middle. When it comes to abortion, even before I was ever Christian, after learning about human development, abortion was not something that I felt comfortable with. And I know a lot of people who are not religious at all, but who are pro-life simply because, scientifically it is a fact that life begins at conception and that an embryo is a unique set of DNA distinct from the mother that can never be re-replicated. So I think there's enough there where it doesn't necessarily need to be a religious position. And I've done videos about the abortion debate before, and I never bring religion into it just because, if you're someone who's Christian, you're trying to convince someone who's not Christian that abortion is wrong. Talking about it from a Christian perspective isn't going to mean much because they're not Christian. And that's besides the fact that there is tons and tons of reasons and research and scientific literature as to why an embryo or a fetus is alive, is distinct, that, we don't really need to bring religion, I think, into that conversation to have a worthy debate. When it comes to gay marriage was something that I never really opposed from a government perspective, and I still don't, because I think, and what I'm learning more and more, especially when I got married, I had to do a marriage course to get married in the Catholic Church. Marriage from a biblical perspective is not what marriage is today, especially not, like you go and sign at the courthouse, that type of marriage. Where a lot of people, when they say, oh, let's get married, it's more like, hey, let's have a public ceremony showing that we love each other and that we want to spend our lives together. And also we'll have, shared legal say over assets. That is very different than what marriage is from a biblical perspective. I think from a biblical perspective, it's very clear that, man and woman come together for the purpose of procreation before God. And that is something that is unique between a man and a woman. That's not what society treats marriage as anymore, for better or worse. But, in terms of a civil type of union, recognizing that a gay couple has the same legal rights as a straight couple, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, so do you have gay friends that are married?
That are married? No. Actually, I guess I would call Dave Rubin a friend, but I definitely have gay single friends.
Gotcha. So Dave, for example, Dave's been on our show. I mean, maybe not bring Dave into it because I know you guys are friends, but let's say you're single friends, they decide to get married. I mean, so where is that divide? I mean, so you don't believe in the government aspect?
I would see their marriage as no less legitimate than straight secular friends.
Gotcha. So you wouldn't go to their wedding, basically, if they were to invite you.
I would go to their wedding because it's not a religious ceremony. These are two people who are basically telling the world we love each other. That God has nothing to do with it in their minds. What really frustrates me, and this is, I guess, especially apparent in the Methodist Church, is when you try to redefine biblically what marriage is to fit the secular definition. Mm-hmm. I think that is something that is pretty clear is not okay if you claim to be a Christian. But in terms of, and this goes beyond the issue of gay marriage as well. Even the issue of divorce. Right. Divorce is something, it frustrates me seeing a lot of Christians kind of rail against gay marriage as if that's what's breaking the sanctity of marriage. But really, I mean, straight people were defiling its meaning way before this ever became an issue with things like divorce and having children out of wedlock. So it's the sanctity of marriage is a much bigger conversation than just, oh, can gay people participate in it or not? And that's something that was really made apparent to me. Again, like in that marriage course, we did a whole unit of kind of like the sacrament of marriage, of what exactly it means. And it's so much more than secular culture. At least, the difference between a secular marriage and a Christian marriage, very, very different, very different.
Mm-hmm. And from the biblical perspective, let's say, for what God intends for people of Christian faith or other religions that are not for gay marriage, what is it about the differences between a man and woman getting married that is perhaps superior or that is fitting to that religion versus a man and a man and a woman and a woman?
Well, I think if we read what it says in Scripture, the part of it is coming together for God, before God, to form a new family with procreation, right? So it really, really is, and we see that in nature as well. Like it's, when animals even come together to form a family, you do have that male and the female aspect to it because that's just how it works biologically. But now, of course, when you say, oh, I'm getting married, it's no longer the same as saying I am pledging to start my family with this person and have children together. You have couples who get married with no intention of having children. So that's part of how marriage in a secular sense is not the same as it is in a religious sense. Never mind things like divorce. For a lot of people, marriage isn't even till death do us part. It's just until we maybe no longer feel like it. Mm-hmm. It's kind of just like a step up from it's like a more long-term boyfriend. That's very, very different. And, I think the biblical idea of marriage is something that it's very rare to see in today's culture, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, just look at the divorce rates. More and more people don't have children, and all of that. So there's a lot of differences besides just gender that set it apart.
Sure, yeah. So it's children, you're saying. That's what it comes down to.
The ability to, create children, because some people might say, well, what if it turns out that you can't have, children yourself? The intent to say before God, like, we are coming together, we are starting this family, like, for posterity, with the goal of like raising children and things like that. Like, that's something, and there's that permanence as well. That is something that is not in line with the modern idea of marriage, like at all.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder, like, why there has to be such a strictness to that. I mean, for example, say there was these two couples and both of them have certainly very histories, whether it's criminal histories or, let's say just certain things that if they were to have children, they would be bringing in potential harm into the world because of, the certain genetic factors or whatever it might be, right? Certain histories. Can you say that is still technically better than a very healthy-minded, economically well-to gay couples adopting someone and perhaps creating a better life for someone that wouldn't have a home?
But you're coming from this from a secular standpoint and saying that, like, even like a Christian standpoint doesn't say that a straight couple is better than a gay couple. It's just that a straight couple is able to fit the mold to have that family, right? It's not about better or worse. And I think there's still that secular sense that marriage is about declaring your love in that. No one is saying that the love between like two gay people is less than the love between two straight people. But again, Christian biblical marriage is not just a confirmation of love, right? That's something that modern society has instilled in our head. Mm-hmm. So it's a completely different thing. And it's not to say that if you're, getting married as a Christian, you shouldn't love your spouse, because of course you do. But you have to realize that entering into that covenant before God, it's almost like saying, like, why can't a Girl Scout join, or why can't a girl join the Boy Scouts? It's because the Boy Scouts is for boys, and doesn't mean that a girl can't be an awesome scout and do the same activities or whatever, but it's that this institution is for boys. Is the Girl Scout lesser than? No. Should she be banned from going into the forest at all? I definitely don't think so, but it's just not the same.
Right. But when you're saying that you don't support gay marriage, you're technically banning, from at least your own perspective.
But did I say I don't support gay marriage? I have no problem with, if you want to go to a courthouse, that's fine. What I support in the church is that I think that biblical marriages need to fit within what is described within the Bible. And to me, that is a big difference.
Sure. And from like, I guess a devil's advocate would say that, from the Bible perspective, it was technically written by other humans, obviously from the perspective of what God would want, how would you counteract something like that? And this is just from like a devil's advocate, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's something that we hear a lot, especially even from other Christians with regard to the question of, is homosexuality as just a concept wrong, as a practice? And that's something that I don't take a stand on very much, because I'm not sure, but when we look at the institution of marriage specifically, it's not like, with homosexuality, when Christians talk about it being wrong, there are like 3 verses, I think, mostly from the Old Testament, that they talk about. So we can have that conversation for sure. But when it comes to the institution of marriage as a whole, it's a lot more than just 3 verses that have been picked and chosen. And we can talk about when they say this, are they even referring to gay marriage or just this one particular act? Is there a translation issue? Like, these are all things that I've heard in regard to the question of whether homosexuality itself is wrong. And I think that is a very interesting conversation to have. But those same criticisms don't really apply to what marriage is, right? Because it's not just we're talking about a couple of lines of scriptures, right? Marriage as an institution has, in the Catholic Church and before that, the Jewish tradition, thousands and thousands of years talking about what it is not, supported by many, many parts of the Bible. So it would be hard for me to wrap my head around it and still call myself a Christian if I were to believe that the Bible could be that wrong about this many things. Because I acknowledge, written by man, translation errors, whatever, perhaps some leeway on certain situations. But when we're talking about core tenets, it's a little bit harder to, try and pick and choose that while still remaining a Christian.
Right. Yeah. Translation is definitely a big topic around kind of.
And understandably so.
Right. And for people that have studied the Bible and try to interpret it based on, the different translations from its origins, is it like pretty much like 100% belief that there is no misinterpretation about homosexuality and gay marriage for the people that have generally studied it?
Homosexuality and gay marriage are different things.
Different things, yes.
Yeah, they are different things. Like, if we're talking, there are several parts of the Bible that do talk about, things like sodomy, the homosexual act, and, not lying with a man as one does with a woman. And, these are the areas where there has been debate over translation issues, right? For example, if we're talking about sodomy, like, did they mean like rape or something like that? Did they specifically mean same-sex relations, or does this apply to a man and woman as well? There is a debate over that. And if we also look at, people have brought up the fact that, Jesus, when he came, he doesn't talk about homosexuality at all. He does talk about marriage and adultery, but not about homosexuality. So can we say, should this issue be at the forefront of our religion? What we're preaching the most, if it's not even covered specifically in the Gospels? And I think that's why I'm not very strong on this issue, because I feel like I don't have enough information, and there is this debate on there. So that's why, but when it comes to the issue of marriage specifically, that is something that is different than homosexuality. And again, like, marriage is an institution in Christianity. It is a covenant. It is a sacrament. It is a promise. It's very different than just loving someone or having a relationship with someone, right? Because it's not just between you two. It is between God and your future children. So, trying to separate those nowadays, I know, doesn't really make sense to people, but the Bible is quite clear on that. Sure.
And do you feel, I know you're obviously you're planning to have a newborn. I don't know exactly when the timeline is, but in a world where you have children that are also growing up to, obviously we have gender dysphoria now. There's a lot of things that are happening in a world where that could happen. Do you feel like you would not have a change of heart in terms of your beliefs if your children were also gay or bigender or whatever it might be?
Yeah, well, for sure. I think when it comes to children, the most important thing is that I will love my children and do what is best for them and do everything I can to make sure that they are able to live a good life. When it comes to whether I think I should redefine what a biblical marriage means in order to fit my, the way that I personally feel. I think that is a slippery slope. And someone who does like to, I guess, to quote Ben Shapiro, put facts before feelings. I don't think I should shape my worldview based on what makes me feel the best. But again, like within my worldview, I think I would be totally capable of loving and cherishing a gay son, or, someone, a child who does have gender dysphoria, whatever that may be, and still love them and nourish them and want them to do the best in their life that they possibly can.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not about changing the pure definition of it, I guess, is because of the fact that you have explored different aspects of religion and atheism as well. I was curious to know if that is something that, obviously you can't change the beliefs of Christianity, but if you would be somewhere around the hybrid, or maybe convert back into atheism or agnosticism, if that was something to be happen. I guess I'm curious to know your stance on that.
Well, I guess like if I at one point decide that the Bible doesn't make sense because I've changed my mind on like what exactly an ultimate morality will look like, that's one thing. But I think if there's any time, any point of contention where I'm still a Christian, I still believe in it, but on this one issue, I don't like what the Bible says, even if I don't like it, I am more willing to concede to what the Bible says, just because I know as humans, our understanding, our interpretation of what is right and wrong is flawed. That's I'm a Calvinist, so that's a huge part of my belief system as well. I think it's better to err on the side of caution and err on the side of what has been proven to uphold families and civilizations, and submit to what the Bible says rather than trying to use my own flawed reasoning. I'm in a position where I don't have that. I don't have cognitive dissonance on any issue. But if that were to arise, if I were to have a change of heart, I would hope that a change of heart doesn't automatically mean a change of brain or head or reasoning.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. And obviously I'm asking all these questions just because I'm genuinely curious, coming from my own journey. And I'm sure a lot of people are dealing with it. So I appreciate you answering these. To close off, Lauren, I think one of the things that you're talking about, kind of the sense of purpose and identity, obviously there's a lot of people that are lost today in terms of what their beliefs are, whether it's the religion or whether it's what stuff that's happening around the world. Why do you think so many people are lost, and how would you advise someone that is perhaps in their early 20s or mid 20s or 30s? Who knows? People are lost. There's no age limit to being lost. Mm-hmm. How would you advise someone to kind of help them find themselves a little bit more?
Well, I would say find purpose and find meaning. In the Republic, it talks about justice happening when everything and everyone is serving its purpose. And so for me, I find I have the most meaning and the happiest when I am fulfilling what I see to be my purpose. So that means, being a good wife, being a good daughter, and being good at my job, and being, a good Christian. If I can fulfill my roles that I've been given responsibly and well, that to me brings happiness and purpose. And I think for a lot of people, like that sense it's kind of missing. We no longer know what we're supposed to do, what is meaning anymore. And I would advise anyone who's feeling lost to also look at Jordan B. Peterson's work, because he is really great, but he talks about the same sorts of things, right? Improve yourself before you look outward and start complaining about what's wrong with the world and all of that. With that being said, though, there are things as a society that I think we could be doing a lot better to help people. I think the fact that we've, really broken down family ties, as well as now with like COVID and everything, even like friendship ties, we can't see anybody. We're atomized. That can be very, very discouraging. Seek out those connections. Even if it's not a romantic one, even just friendship can go a long way in giving you, a sense of purpose, because then that's someone who, you want to do good for, to hold yourself accountable for being a good friend. And it's the same with any of your other areas, whether that's in your work. do well at your work, do well in your studies, be the best that you can be in all of these different things. And I think for a lot of people, they will find meaning in that. And I would also say don't neglect, I don't even want to say spiritual side of this, because even if you're an atheist, I think there is a lot of philosophy and things that you could look into that might train your mind to things that aren't material, but that are still very important for us as humans to be in tune with if we want to feel like we're, I guess, a well-rounded person. It's not just enough to live in the material world. Our brain and our hearts need more than that.
Yeah, you read a lot of philosophy. So what are some of the philosophers that you recommend people to study? Are there books, particularly like Stoicism obviously is kind of regaining this new life now. What do you recommend?
For sure. Well, I know one of my friends, Lydia, she's a Stoic, and Stoicism is really interesting. I like Plato and Aristotle a lot when it comes to, I guess, morality, right versus wrong nature of man. The Republic is very interesting, but I'm not going to say I endorse the Republic as a political philosophy because that's somewhat totalitarian. But, in terms of just like moral wanderings, it's very, very interesting. I think Leviathan is a good read as well. If you haven't read The Wealth of Nations, I encourage you to do that. If you're coming from the more political or economic perspective of things. And actually something that, where is it? Oh yeah. This Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Unfortunately, this is very, very topical for the time that we're living in, because she talks about, the totalitarian state. One of the things that it does is it chips away at the connections and loyalties you have to your friends and to your family. It's called atomization, so that you're more and more just reliant on the state. And we saw that in the Soviet Union, in communist China, children were encouraged to rat out their parents and things like that. So it's really interesting. And of course, 1984 is another example of that, maybe, where you can kind of see the similarities to what we're living through right now.
Beautiful. Well, we'll have all those in the link show notes. Lauren, thanks so much. Where can people learn more about you? And I know you've got multiple different channels, so feel free to let them know what's top of mind.
Sure. So if you're interested in the political videos that I do, you can find me just by searching Lauren Chen on YouTube. Those videos are also, I'm trying to be everywhere right now just because social media it's been really unstable. Facebook, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, and Minds.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. It's such a nightmare to upload to all of these different platforms. But yeah, you can find the political videos on those platforms. And if you're interested in like pop culture, movies and stuff like that, I also have a channel on YouTube called Mediaholic. And it's just like movie reviews and entertainment news. It's a lot lighter than what we've been discussing in this conversation.
For sure. Well, thanks so much, Lauren. I really appreciate you having the time to come on. And thanks so much for tuning in, guys.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.